The training facility in Tel Aviv fell silent. It was March 2019, and Israel's premier combat training center had gathered the world's most respected martial arts instructors for the International Close Quarters Combat Symposium. Military trainers from 17 nations filled the observation hall, each representing their country's most elite fighting systems. Among them stood Avi Goldstein, Israel's most decorated Krav Maga instructor. At 42 years old, 6'1" and 195 pounds of pure muscle, Avi had spent 25 years perfecting Israel's legendary combat system. He trained Israeli Defense Forces elite units, consulted for international security agencies, and authored 3 books on practical combat that were required reading in military academies worldwide. His reputation was built on one principle: effectiveness over aesthetics. When the Filipino delegation took the stage, Avi leaned back in his chair with barely concealed skepticism. Carlos Mendez, a 38-year-old Filipino Eskrima master, stood at 5'9" and 165 pounds, seemingly small compared to the other instructors present. Carlos wore a simple black training uniform, and beside him lay an array of training blades and sticks that represented centuries of Filipino warrior tradition. "Today I'll demonstrate the principles of Filipino blade combat," Carlos began in accented English, specifically the integration of. Avi's scoff cut through the room like a knife. Every head turned. Filipino knife fighting? Avi's voice carried the authority of decades. "With respect, Mr. Mendez, we're here to discuss combat systems that work in real-world scenarios. What you're about to show us, these elaborate stick patterns, these flashy blade demonstrations, they look impressive in exhibitions. But against a trained opponent, against someone who actually wants to kill you." He shook his head. "It's dance, not combat." The room erupted in uncomfortable murmurs. Several instructors shifted in their seats. Some nodded in agreement with Avi's assessment. Others looked toward Carlos, waiting for his response. Avi continued, standing now, commanding the room's attention. "I've spent my entire career stripping away the unnecessary. Krav Maga works because it's brutal, direct, efficient. No forms, no kata, no performance. You attack the body's vulnerabilities. You neutralize threats. You survive. These Filipino systems," he gestured dismissively toward Carlos's weapons, "they come from a different era. Village warfare, tribal conflicts. They worked against opponents with similar weapons and similar training, but modern combat." He pointed to diagrams on the screen behind him, showing Krav Maga's direct line attacks. "You need systems designed for today's threats, not historical reenactments." The Australian Special Forces instructor 2 rows back nodded. "Avi has a point. We've analyzed dozens of traditional martial arts. Most don't translate to modern combat scenarios." Carlos stood quietly through the entire dismissal, his expression calm, almost serene. What the room didn't know was that Carlos came from a family that had preserved Filipino martial arts for 7 generations. His great-great-grandfather had been a warrior during the Philippine Revolution. His grandfather had taught combat to Filipino guerrillas during World War II. His father had been a police instructor who'd used Eskrima in hundreds of real encounters. Carlos had heard this dismissal before. In every international forum, at every military demonstration, traditional Filipino martial arts were labeled as performance, cultural dance, impractical. What these modern instructors didn't understand was that Filipino blade combat had evolved through constant testing, not in dojos or training halls, but in actual life-and-death encounters spanning centuries. "Mr. Goldstein," Carlos finally spoke, his voice steady and respectful, "I understand your skepticism, Krav Maga has earned its reputation through effectiveness. I would never dispute that. He paused, meeting Avi's eyes. But perhaps effectiveness can take different forms. Perhaps what appears flashy to an untrained eye is actually the result of understanding blade dynamics at a level that goes beyond simple direct attacks. Avi's expression showed polite condescension. Blade dynamics? Mr. Mendez, a knife fight lasts seconds. You need to disable your opponent before they disable you. Everything else is academic. Then perhaps, Carlos said calmly, we should test these principles practically, not in theory, not in debate, in demonstration. The room went completely silent. A challenge? Avi's eyebrow raised. You're suggesting we face off? Not a fight, Carlos clarified. A demonstration. Live blade defense scenarios. You defend using Krav Maga principles. I defend using Filipino blade combat principles. Neutral judges score based on effectiveness, efficiency, and survivability. Let the techniques speak for themselves. For a moment Avi looked genuinely surprised. Then a slow smile spread across his face. Mr. Mendez, I respect your confidence. Very well, but understand, when Krav Maga principles prove superior, as they will, I hope you'll acknowledge that these traditional systems belong in cultural demonstrations, not combat training. The symposium organizers, sensing the historic nature of this moment, immediately began arrangements. This wasn't just a demonstration anymore, it was a test of philosophies. Modern scientific combat training versus centuries-old warrior traditions. Israeli military efficiency versus Filipino martial heritage. 6 months passed. The demonstration was scheduled for September 2019 at a neutral facility in Singapore. Word spread through international martial arts and military communities. The International Combat Federation agreed to judge. The venue filled with over 300 spectators, military instructors, martial artists, combat sports athletes, and security professionals from 40 countries. Cameras lined the walls. This would be live-streamed to martial arts schools and military training facilities worldwide. Avi arrived with his team, confident and prepared. He'd spent the 6 months refining his blade defense techniques, studying Filipino knife-fighting videos to understand what Carlos might attempt. He'd concluded that the elaborate movements would create openings his direct Krav Maga counters would exploit. Carlos arrived quietly, carrying only a simple equipment bag. With him was his mentor, Grandmaster Ramon Santos, a 76-year-old Filipino master who'd survived actual blade encounters during his years as a police officer in Manila. The old man's scarred forearms told stories of real combat that no amount of training could replicate. The demonstration began with Scenario 1. Defense against single-blade attack. The professional stunt coordinator would execute realistic knife attacks. Each defender would demonstrate their system's response. Attacks would come from various angles: high slashes, low stabs, reverse grip, forward grip. Judges would score based on efficiency of movement, likelihood of survival, and control of the attacker. Avi went first. The attacker came with a forward slash. Avi's response was textbook Krav Maga: aggressive forward movement, simultaneous block and strike, control of the weapon arm, brutal knee to the attacker's body, weapon disarm. 5 seconds. Effective. Powerful. The audience applauded. The judges marked their scores. Carlos's turn. The same attack pattern. But what happened next made everyone in the room lean forward. Carlos didn't move like Avi had. There was no aggressive forward charge. Instead, his body shifted with minimal movement. A subtle angle change that looked almost casual. His hand moved in a flowing motion that simultaneously redirected the blade, trapped the attacker's wrist, and positioned Carlos on the outside of the attack line. The attacker's momentum carried him past Carlos, completely off balance. Carlos's training blade touched 3 lethal points on the attacker's body: throat, kidney, spine, in a motion so fluid it looked choreographed. Total time, 3 seconds. The room went quiet. Again, one of the judges called, "Different attack pattern." The attacks continued. High reverse slash, low stab, overhead ice pick grip. Each time the contrast became more apparent. Avi's defenses were powerful and direct. He met force with force, blocked with strength, countered with aggression. Every technique worked, every defense succeeded, but each required significant physical commitment. Each left brief moments of mutual vulnerability. Each took effort. Carlos's defenses looked almost effortless. His body moved in ways that seemed to violate physics. Slight weight shifts that created maximum effect. Hand movements that simultaneously defended and attacked. Footwork that placed him in positions where the attacker's blade could never reach him, while his counterblade found openings instantly. What Avi and the audience were witnessing was something the Israeli instructor hadn't understood. Filipino blade combat wasn't about flashy movements for show. Every motion, every angle, every transition had been refined through generations of actual combat. The elaborate patterns weren't dance, they were sophisticated geometry. The unnecessary movements weren't excess. They were deception, misdirection, and efficiency at a level that went beyond simple direct force. By scenario 3, defense against multiple attackers, the difference became undeniable. Avi faced 2 attackers with training blades. His response was brave and aggressive. Disable one quickly, turn to the other, use maximum force. He succeeded, but the judges noted he'd absorbed what would have been several serious cuts in the process. The technique worked through toughness and willingness to trade damage. Carlos faced the same scenario. What happened next would be analyzed in martial arts schools for years. Carlos didn't try to fight both attackers. Instead, he moved with such precise timing and positioning that he kept one attacker between himself and the other. His blade work created a constant threat that forced both attackers into defensive reactions. He controlled distance, angle, and timing so completely that neither attacker could commit to an attack without exposing themselves. Within 15 seconds, Carlos had disabled both attackers without receiving a single scoring touch. The head judge, the Russian Sistema master, stood up. "Stop, I need to see that again." They ran it 3 more times. The result was the same. Carlos wasn't stronger or faster than Avi, but his understanding of blade dynamics, spatial relationships, and timing was operating at a completely different level. Avi watched the replays on the monitors, and something shifted in his expression. The confidence gave way to concentration, then to genuine curiosity. He was watching something he didn't fully understand, and as a true martial artist, that intrigued him. The final scenario was the most challenging. Confined space defense. Both defenders would be in a narrow corridor, simulating hallways, stairwells, or close-quarters urban environments, facing an attacker with a blade. This was where Krav Maga should have dominated. The system was literally designed for such scenarios. Limited space favored direct, aggressive techniques. Avi's demonstration was textbook perfect. Explosive forward movement, brutal strikes, weapon control. He succeeded. But again, the judges noted he would have sustained significant injuries in a real scenario. The confined space limited his options for force-based defense. When Carlos entered the corridor, everyone expected him to struggle. Limited space should have neutered his system's reliance on movement and angles. Instead, Carlos demonstrated why Filipino martial arts had evolved in bamboo groves, jungle trails, and narrow village paths. The confined space didn't limit him, it concentrated his advantages. Every minor angle shift had maximum effect. The walls and narrow space that limited Avi's power movements created geometric advantages for Carlos's blade work. His weapon moved in tight, efficient patterns that seemed to create space where none existed. His defense looked more effective in the confined area than it had in the open. When the final scores were tallied, the results were clear. Both systems were effective. Both could save lives. But in pure technical efficiency, survivability, and versatility, the Filipino blade combat principles had demonstrated superiority in every scenario. The room sat in stunned silence as the judges announced their decision. Then Avi Goldstein did something that elevated him beyond just being a skilled fighter. He became a true martial artist. He walked across the demonstration floor to where Carlos stood. Every eye in the venue watched. "Carlos," Avi said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I was wrong, completely wrong." He extended his hand and Carlos took it. "I called your art flashy demonstration. I dismissed it as cultural performance. But what I witnessed today..." He shook his head with genuine humility. "That was the most sophisticated close-quarters combat system I've ever encountered." The room erupted in applause, but Avi raised his hand for silence. "I need to explain something to everyone here. I didn't lose because Carlos is better than me. I lost because my understanding was limited. I've spent 25 years mastering one approach to combat, the direct approach. Force, aggression, efficiency, and that approach works. But watching Carlos today, I realized that efficiency isn't just about being direct. Sometimes the most efficient path is the one that uses geometry, timing, and understanding at such a deep level that force becomes almost unnecessary." He turned back to Carlos. "Your ancestors who developed this system, they weren't performing. They were solving problems that took my system hundreds of years and modern scientific analysis to approach. And in some ways, they solved them better." Carlos bowed respectfully. "Master Avi, Krav Maga is excellent for what it was designed to do. My art comes from different circumstances, different needs. They're not better or worse. They're different solutions to the same problem, survival." But Avi shook his head. "No, Carlos. Be proud of what you've demonstrated today. This wasn't just technique. This was art and science combined at the highest level. And it came from your culture, your heritage, your ancestors' wisdom. The world needs to understand that traditional martial arts aren't historical curiosities. They're repositories of sophisticated knowledge that we're still learning to appreciate." The video of this exchange went viral. Within a week, it had been viewed over 200 million times. Martial arts schools worldwide began reaching out to Filipino instructors. Military training programs started investigating Filipino blade combat principles. Security training academies requested Filipino martial arts consultants. The International Combat Federation officially recognized Filipino martial arts systems for military and law enforcement training certification, something they'd never done for any traditional martial art before. But perhaps the most significant outcome happened quietly. Avi Goldstein flew to Manila 3 months later and spent 2 weeks training under Grandmaster Ramon Santos. The 76-year-old master and the Israeli instructor became close friends. Avi began incorporating Filipino blade principles into his Krav Maga instruction, creating a hybrid system that honored both approaches. "I thought I knew everything about knife combat," Avi would later tell his students. Carlos showed me I'd barely scratched the surface. The Filipino masters have been studying blade dynamics for centuries. We're just catching up. Carlos never sought fame from the demonstration. He returned to his small training school in Manila, teaching the same principles his family had preserved for generations. But now, students came from around the world, seeking to understand the sophistication hidden in what others had dismissed as cultural dance. Grandmaster Ramon, when asked about the demonstration's significance, smiled with the wisdom of someone who'd survived real blade encounters. People always confuse simplicity with effectiveness. They think if something looks complex, it must be impractical. But Carlos didn't use complexity. He used precision. Every movement had purpose. Every angle created advantage. That's not flash. That's efficiency at its highest form. The story teaches us that effectiveness takes many forms. Sometimes the most sophisticated solutions don't look like what we expect. The Israeli approach, direct, forceful, scientifically analyzed, is effective and valuable. The Filipino approach, geometric, fluid, refined through centuries of actual combat, is equally effective and valuable. Both can coexist. Both can learn from each other. True mastery isn't about proving your way is the only way. It's about recognizing excellence wherever it appears, even when it challenges everything you thought you knew. Avi Goldstein became a better martial artist not by defending his ego, but by opening his mind to wisdom that came from a different path. And perhaps most importantly, never mistake tradition for obsolescence. What appears to be ancient may actually be timeless. What looks like performance may actually be perfection. The ancestors who developed these systems weren't primitive. They were solving the same problems we face today, and sometimes their solutions were more sophisticated than anything modern science has produced. Filipino blade combat didn't need validation. It had been validated in countless real encounters across centuries. But the world needed to learn what Carlos's ancestors had always known. True effectiveness comes not from force alone, but from understanding so deep it looks effortless.